Cool. Yay. Are we good?
We are live.
You guys can hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Taylor Renee. I am 1/4 of the Black Art Incubator, based here in Detroit. So I'm joining you virtually along with Cezanne Charles, who will be our program session leader for the day. Cezanne Charles co-directs rootoftwo, a hybrid design studio based in Metro Detroit, and is a creative economy professional working as director of creative industries at Creative Mini. Creative Mini is a statewide organization in Detroit that develops creative people, places, and economy for competitive Michigan. I'm super excited to introduce and welcome Cezanne Charles. I think she has a encyclopedic knowledge of just general economies and creative economy. And specifically through Creative Mini, they work to find the intrinsic value and articulate the intrinsic value of the creative economy and how it relates to other economies. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Cezanne. Enjoy.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to switch to a screen share because I do have a little bit of a PowerPoint, but just in order to tell you how I'm thinking about the time is I want to kind of go through a PowerPoint that I have, which is generally how I've been thinking about this idea of rereading the creative economy. And in some cases, it's about kind of reintroducing the creative economy, because I think the way that most of us were introduced to it is an understatement to say was problematic. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I come to it, how my work has evolved at Creative Mini, and then I'm going to kind of get off of the PowerPoint and then maybe talk to you a little bit about like why me as a creative practitioner, the way that rootoftwo approaches its work, kind of thinks about this, and the way that, you know, quite often this kind of research-based approach both pervades my work at Creative Mini and also the way that we approach our creative practice, and specifically some ideas that we have about the economy as we've kind of experienced it. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to switch over now to doing a screen share, and then I'll be back in a little bit. So see you in a minute. All right, so that started kind of in the middle. Let's try that again. Okay, so as Taylor said, I'm Cezanne Charles. I'm Director of Creative Industries at Creative Mini Michigan. You can hit me up at ACE_Wong or at Creative Mini if you want to follow what Creative Mini is doing, or if you want to find out a little bit more about the creative industries in Michigan. So as Taylor said, we develop creative people, creative places, and the creative economy for a more competitive Michigan. And as you can see already within that mission statement, there's a lot that's in there that really is talking about a kind of basic idea of kind of exchange value, supply side, economics that's kind of laden within that. But I'm going to talk about the way that in practice we kind of debunk a little bit of that. And so for our work, we really like to say internally we take an evidence-based approach, and we do that to our advocacy and policy-making work, a programs and services approach, a funding and investment approach, and a strategic communications approach. And the way that we think about evidence-based is not that it's data-driven, like you hear that term a lot. We are not sort of in the space where we're prioritizing kind of quantitative measures over, say, the more qualitative. But it's really about making a case for arguing for there to be some deliberation and also some engagement from the get-go by our stakeholders, by our constituents, into how we really think about each of those kind of areas of our work. And so some of the initiatives that we work on fall into kind of three main categories. Empower, which is probably one of the areas I work on the most, does a lot of our professional practice for individual artists, creative practitioners. It includes the way that we are trying to build context around creative practice, and so networking and dialogue is a really important thing for us as well. And then we have special one-off initiatives that could turn into full programs like Make Plus Do, that was developed originally by one of my colleagues who's now going to grad school, but is really looking at kind of the maker, manufacturer, the artisan, storefront owner. So we're able to kind of very quickly hear things that are happening on the ground in our communities with our stakeholders, then try and get some fidelity around them, some evidence around them, and then develop programming out of them that then tries to spit back out in a very quick and very iterative way things that actually are interventions that are designed to help or be transformative. And so we also do that on the way that we think about investing in artists and creatives. So we have a small grant program that we've been working with the Ford Foundation on. We also are beginning to think about it really deeply about the way that we have principles around procurement and commissioning in New York. So are we always, where possible, using kind of local artist-based businesses, whether that's designers, creatives, or others. But today I'm going to talk to you about another side of the work that is actually pretty collaborative across our entire team. We co-lead quite often on research and impact studies, and then as well as we think about kind of state and national advocacy and public policy, we have a great director of public policy, but there's a lot of groupthink around how we go from policy to practice and back again. So first, let me say that I start from a position of skepticism. I take a pretty agnostic approach to our research projects, our methods, and what economic models we're coming from. I'm not espousing one particular economic model over another. When I'm thinking about our research and I'm thinking about our methodologies, I don't have a way of prioritizing that the quantitative is more important than the qualitative. And in our most recent work, we've actually been doing a lot more things that are mixed methods, because there is this idea that we have to move away from kind of this idea that there's this capital T truth in all of these things, or that all of these things are from a kind of scientific rationalist point of view. And so I almost always start everything with a kind of healthy dose of skepticism, but belief at the same time. So I use the idea of being agnostic. And the first thing that I want to say is, quite often when most of us think about the creative economy, or most of us kind of encountered it for the first time, we came at it really from a lot of Richard Florida's thinking and work, which was grounded in a kind of neoclassical, almost into developmentalist point of view on economics. And so the first thing I would say is that there are 9 models, 9 different schools of competing thoughts in some cases, and sometimes complementary thoughts around economics. So even when we think about capitalism, we tend to sort of think that capitalism is one thing. At least on this slide, 3 or 4 of these easily would fit under what we would think of as capitalism as it's practiced today. And in different national economies, some of these are much more clearly favored. So if you sort of think about the UK, where I first kind of encountered the creative economy and the creative industries, it wasn't based on this idea really from a kind of neoclassical point of view, because their starting point is fundamentally different than the US. Their starting point was a really heavy reliance until probably like the late 1970s in a kind of Keynesian economic model based on classes. And so a lot of the time we have different starting points in our national ideology, in our national economies, that really radically change what we mean and what we think of when we talk about something as obtuse as the creative industries or the creative economy. And that's why I say it's like, how do you have this really flexible understanding that there is a role to say that the creative economy economy, or my rereading of the creative economy, is really about how do you restore kind of economic justice to the creator, to the producer. Some of the most original, like some of the early definitions, rather, of the creative industries were all centered around this idea of exchange value for intellectual property that then is given a kind of bounded monopoly, because as the creator you can file copyrights, you can file trademarks, you can file patents, and that protects you. That kind of gives you a certain amount of bounded monopoly. And, you know, in a classic sense, if the market could bear it, then you would be remunerated for that idea. Except we have had those intermediaries and interventions both at market levels and government levels and even philanthropic levels in terms of picking winners and losers in that kind of exploitation of the kind of exchange value. And so, you know, the classic idea is that somehow the musician who authors the work is almost always remunerated less than the intermediary that both produces, markets, publicizes it. You know, the artist is almost always remunerated less, and the burden is almost always put at the front end of a creative practice rather than the end of a creative practice on that cultural producer, on that creative producer, while there's a kind of steady state of kind of finance or remuneration for the intermediary, right, which we used to think of as the gatekeeper or the tastemaker, and that's everything from a philanthropy to a curator to others, right? And so we have this system where for a long time when we think about the arts, we even talk about them as these really high risk, low return endeavors that are done by geniuses or failed misanthropes. And so our economic models and sort of the culture we have created around the support of that actually reflects that in the way that we have historically funded and treated and set the expectation level around the artist. So that's everything from really making it almost heroic, the belief in poverty, the rhetoric that we continue to spell out about not selling out. And so a lot of this for me really was like, how do we flip that script and start thinking about how do we buy in, right? So how do I, as an individual artist, creative practitioner who had a Bachelor of Arts in theater, really think about how I can make sure that I am entitled to a living and a life doing what I love, and that should not be something that I can be penalized for based on markets that were always unequal and always unfair for me. And so a lot of it was about how do I educate myself in that, and really how do I think about where I fit, like what is my stance, what is my route into this. So for me it was a really important turning point to realize that there are these economic models, they are fluid, they can be broken down into pretty plain language, that you see on this chart, and it's just quite often that when you hear economists or others talk about it, there's an obfuscation, right, that happens. But we all know, like, even in the arts, the devil's in the detail. We speak to each other in our own jargon all the time. So it's not that it's necessarily being done against us, but it's just that it's definitely not always for us. And so, if I had to say where I lie these days because of my interest in kind of the way that we're rethinking innovation economies, and also I sort of fall in the kind of Schumpeterian institutionalist behavioralist personally in terms of the economic models that I'm most interested in. So here's my little heresy, and it's a heresy that if you talk to other creative industries researchers, if you talk to other kind of policy people, and especially if you are really in the United States thinking about the fact that we almost always operate in a kind of socio-technical imaginary that is thinking about this trend towards rationalization, there's this idea that data will save us. And so I just really don't believe that more and better data simply leads to more and better impact. You know, that more and better data definitely does not always equal more and better investment in the arts, because if that was the case, we would have one of the best funded creative education systems in the world, because there has been a lot of both quantitative and qualitative data about the effects of that, and yet we haven't seen the return on investment for those studies. So we know this to be true, and it definitely means that more and better data does not always equal more and better policy, because if that were the case, we would have actually been able to do the heavy lift around thinking about what our national funding should be for the arts and the creative industries, what our local investments in the arts and creative industries should be. And so the question isn't about policy, it's about the politics of the policy. What does it take to do the heavy lift to actually make change at all levels? And so there's just this idea that within our system, as we think about the creative economy, we're left with mostly this idea that it's not equal. But we also don't necessarily have the levers of power to sort of really think about what it would mean to be equal, let alone figure out all of the different ways and all of the different coalitions and all of the different allies we would need to build in order to actually get to that more just society, that more just world. And I would argue that that's because it's not fundamentally an arts problem. It's not fundamentally a creative economy problem. It's fundamentally, in the words, I guess, of Bill Clinton, the economy stupid. And so this is what led to our work. We, for the last several years, have been facing in Michigan since I joined about 2007, 2008. We had a governor that nearly eliminated all arts funding. But understanding the politics of our state, understanding the politics of the public policy, we understood that what held sway in our government was this idea fundamentally that there could be data, that there could be information, that the economic frame, if you will. So it's not economics themselves, but it is this reliance on the economic frame as one of the dominant levers of both state, local, and federal government, that if we could only get to good data that was benchmarkable, that was dashboardable, then somehow we might actually begin to be able to build the coffers of our state investment in arts and culture. And so we started doing that completely with only nonprofit data through another data source I'm not going to talk about today. But just like many other things, there's always a ceiling when you're only talking about kind of the nonprofit ecosystem. And that is because fundamentally at its core, individual artists and creative practitioners, whether they make a profit or not, are actually, if they do nothing, designated as for-profit businesses. And so you have this disconnect quite often between the nonprofits that steward the arts and culture and the for-profit creative producers at that fundamental level. And that really led us to think about how could we rethink our work differently to be much more comprehensive, so that we could talk about what happens when a small business becomes a medium-sized business and then becomes a world-leading business. How could we take the idea that something as simple as professors at Cranbrook who were able to subsidize their work in studio in the early years could somehow become the Eames, and then somehow that IP could be the basis of one of our most important companies in the country, Herman Miller. And so we did this. We started really thinking about what it meant to be a creative state in Michigan. How do we really think about creating vibrancy? And again, a lot of these words are like jargons. You've heard them in placemaking and placekeeping circles. You've heard them in economic circles. But it really is something about this idea of being able to play the politics well. And so our 2016 Creative Industries Report begins to sort of pull traditional data. It kind of mimics in a very chameleon way the very efforts of other economic development professionals. It's being able to sort of speak to them in their own language using their own tools. So in some cases, it's not about so much that we became that. It was more that we understood that the things that we were trying to lever fundamentally needed some translation. The value creation that we're hoping to do is still the same at the heart of it. And what's really important for us is that it's very rare in the arts to go from having the U.S. Economic Development Administration fund your work to then seeing major philanthropies, to then seeing sort of higher education and private incubators all be lining up to kind of fund this work in a national study, in a study that, you know, gains national support. So these are our data partners. We never do these things alone. I would never sleep if that was the case. And so we worked with Care Smith, which is a design firm and research firm out of Ontario in Canada, and Data Driven Detroit, which is 2 doors down from where I am right now. And so for us, we have a very broad definition of the creative economy. It's simply the creative industries. That includes all of the creative occupations and non-creative occupations that work in those industries, and then the creative occupations that are found in non-creative businesses. So that would be, for instance, the graphic designer that works in a healthcare organization, on the one end, and then on the other end, that would be no different than, say, you know, the administrative person that works in a major museum. And so that way you're telling a comprehensive story about, like, who is in the creative economy and how do we count them. And so I'm going to blow through, like, our research questions, but the only thing I will say that's important here is that most of the answers to these questions are not quantitative. And so our study really took an approach that was designed to be mixed methods. It was designed to be both quantitative, using data and figures and numbers and charts and graphs and all of those kind of great things. But it was also really designed to be qualitative. It was designed to really think about, like, what was the body of knowledge that existed out there before? How can we reach and work with thought leaders around the country, and specifically in Michigan, to actually do interviews? How could we then do regional workshops that further, like, surfaced what are the key priorities, what are the key barriers, what are the key roadblocks that all of our stakeholders are experiencing, and then rolling that up into a policy summit that, again, was both participatory in the sense that we were able to both hold panels that brought in national and international leaders on this, as well as really highlighting great local and regional examples all together, but then also made sure that throughout the day there was opportunity to sort of generate new knowledge that could then be captured and fed back into our final report.
Cezanne?
Yep.
Really quickly, I think we're having an issue with viewing the PowerPoint. It's stuck on the first page.
Oh. So, it seems like it's moving for me. Okay. All right.
Do you mind it, like, refreshing maybe?
Yeah, I will try that. Because I was, like, nearly towards the end. Okay.
I know. We're missing. Okay, it's moving now.
So you guys can't see it when I actually do it full screen. Okay.
No.
All right, but you can see it if I do it this way.
Yes, it's moving.
Okay, so did you guys miss all the different, like, economic models?
Yeah, we did.
Okay, I will send it to you because they're phenomenally fun to find out about. Anyway, there's 9 of them. Choose 1 or 2 or 3, which is what I did. And here's my hierarchy again. See, look, there are slides. Here are the creative state things that I just talked about, and then that, and then that, and then that.
Awesome.
Okay.
Yep. So we can share this. Yeah, we could share this with our audience
afterwards. Sorry about that.
No.
The questions come up. Okay, so this is where we're back up to. We just, like, sped through that super quickly. So we essentially broke it down into 12 categories. These categories are not dissimilar to the way that most of the other creative industries reports around the world kind of break it down. We have a couple different titles and a couple different names, but they essentially are advertising, architecture, art schools, artists and agents, creative technology, culture and heritage, design, visual arts, crafts, performing arts, music, literary, publishing, print, film, video, broadcasting, fashion, garment, and textile. And so when we think about that, historically we've always thought about these things as traditional industrial classifications that if you were to do really, really boring work, you could go and you could look them up and you could find all of the sub kind of codes underneath those broad headings. And you could classically say that this is what we think of when we think of like the creative workers. The real issue here is that it doesn't allow you to sort of think through what industries might be creative in the future. And there's a real gap in terms of the way that we even think about counting or think about assigning things to codes. And so one of the things that, as we were doing this research, I go off on tangents because I want to know things. And one of the things that became really clear is that there are job descriptions that are on the books, that have been on the books for a number of years, that essentially no one is practicing under, nobody is coding themselves under. And yet there are job descriptions every day in occupations every day that are getting started that right now we have no good classification under. And so there is this kind of jeopardy that, you know, I think everybody should be aware of when we talk about the creative industries. They're not static, they're not fixed, they should be thought of as fluid. And they're also subject to risk, right? They're subject to devaluation. So if you even think about kind of where print and publishing is going, like that's a decimation of what has been a primary driving creative industry for a number of years. It's not that print will ever die, but it's just not going to have the same sort of impact in local economies that it might have. In just a few years, in just a few years from now, as it did, decades ago. And so we also then kind of just did a broad brush for our state findings. And so when you look at our state findings, this is what we're able to say. We're able to sit down with other economic development agencies, with kind of other legislative bodies, and say that, in Michigan, we contribute $4.97 billion in wages. I know I have colleagues in New York that have actually looked at that and done studies that show how much you're able to contribute in wages. And part of this is because there's this idea that some jobs count more, right? Like most of us have heard somewhere on a news report that we're looking out for manufacturing, and those manufacturing jobs aren't coming back. But we're all now talking about advanced manufacturing. And at the same time, we're never getting news stories which are about, what is being contributed in wages from kind of cultural workers, right? As if somehow those jobs and those wages count less. And so our thing was like, how do we just say that there should be some equivalency here, that these jobs matter just as much as any other job matters. These jobs have the ability to contribute vitally to our economy. And it's not about, again, prioritizing this idea that this instrumental view of arts and culture and the creative industries is somehow better. But if we're going to communicate with people that are holding the purse strings at all levels or holding the policy strings at all levels, then we need to sort of figure out how to communicate them in their lingua franca. And in this case, it's numbers, right? But in doing a mixed method studies, we then can complexify that. We can actually then, walk away from numbers and start talking about values. And so that's where our work is really heading. So we look at some of our largest creative industries. We can talk about design being at 19.87. We are in the country one of the highest location quotients for design, which means we just, as a concentration, have more designers based in southeastern Michigan than most any other place on a per capita basis in the US. So funnily enough, Detroit is a UNESCO City of Design, funnily enough, that means that when we're talking about recruiting people into this region, we're going to see a lot more about how good design jobs are coming back to Michigan. Funnily enough, next week we're hosting the national conference of the IDSA. It's no surprise when you begin to sort of understand the mechanics of what is pushing and driving some of these things that seem like arbitrary policy-based decisions. And so we made sure that in our report we included 4 regions, and the regions were Flint, Detroit, Ann Arbor, and Grand Rapids. And one of the things that was really important for us was, how does this report, knowing that it would be disseminated broadly, that it would be the first most comprehensive report on the creative industries in Michigan, how do we really talk about something like the transformation in Detroit? And how do we talk about it in a way that just doesn't buy into false binaries, that doesn't sort of have easy answers, but really is talking about the transformation that's happening in a way that is both seen in the numbers and evidenced in the numbers, but also really seen through the live practices of individual artists and creative practitioners in the ground. And so we also included a lot of case studies that tried to unpick that. But again, you know, when we hear often about Detroit, and for reasons to do with the way that Michigan's economy is broken down, it's based on what is called prosperity regions. So Detroit in this sense really is about Macomb, Oakland, and Wayne County. But when we think about kind of the national news and the national narrative of Detroit, we don't actually often hear anyone say that 2.8 billion in wages comes from the creative industries in Detroit. And yet we hear news story after news story about how surprising it is that we're this powerhouse of creativity. Well, is it really? Is it really, if we can say that we're doing 2.8 billion in wages? Probably not a surprise. They just were asleep at the wheel and not paying attention. You know, and so when we again think about the employment breakdown, we actually see that there are pretty sizable and significant numbers of non-creative workers that are working in the creative industries. You know, and the reason why that's important is because even if they never care about the artist and curator and cultural worker that actually is heading up these institutions, that are heading up these industries, that are running these major departments in corporate organizations, they should care about the other 76,000 workers that are employed through the creative industries. So again, being able to make these arguments, we always hear about the supply chain. When we think about automotive, that it's not just one automotive job, it's the fact that one automotive job supports 10 other jobs. So being able to have that information at the ready to make those same counter arguments means that we're offering counter narratives in the language that they can understand. But the problem really comes in this idea of having to deal with the idea that truthiness exists, right? As much as I want to argue for the fact that, you know, we deal with numbers and we deal with data that is quantitative, that has the appearance of this kind of rationalist point of view, the reality is that anybody that talks to you knows that what we are running at a global level is an adaptive change process, and it has some really quirky and really disturbing outcomes. But fundamentally, what we're thinking about is not just value creation, but revaluing what we mean by value creation. And so the way that I think about it is we really think about being dissatisfied and then having some sort of vision to overcome that dissatisfaction, and then trying to make first and actionable steps that allow us to overcome this idea of resistance to change. All of our economies globally are going through some sort of systematic change. And if we don't manage it carefully, you end up in something where you have a preponderance of voters not knowing what Brexit is and yet voting to actually leave the European Union. If it's not handled carefully, it has really deep and lasting, meaningful political implications to the way that we think fundamentally about what our society is. And so as we think about the fact that for a lot of reasons, whether it be through climate inaction and climate change, whether we think about it from the point of view of automation and digitization and the changing nature of work, we all are slightly dissatisfied with the future that we've seen. And we're sort of in a vacuum right now where there's a compelling or easy vision for the future. And none of us really know what the first actions could and should be. We know that we're trying to build some of those. So you get the Affordable Care Act as a response to this idea that we're going to be displacing workers out of the economy. And so in that sense, we are all attempting to sort of figure out how we are both adapting to and being made resilient for the change that's coming. But the only thing I can say is that, you know, there should be a pause. There should be this idea that just because we're in an age of disruption, in an age of unprecedented change, that there weren't real things that have happened in the past that aren't worth fighting for. And that those are the things that we really have to think about, how we're preserving them, how we're not taking them for granted, and what is fixed and constant that we can argue about for the role of the artist and the creative in society. So the critical questions that I take forward for myself is this idea that, are we in danger of conflating this idea of measurement with judgment? I think we all are trying to figure out how we use better judgment in terms of making calls at both the personal level and the political level. You know, can we as individual practitioners and creative workers really think about leveraging and benefiting from a reframed creative economy, one that actually looks at, you know, with an agnostic eye on what the economic models are, rather than having to create absolute rules that, you know, were never fit for purpose. It's not true that arts plus revitalization always equals gentrification. It's only true if you're operating from a neoclassical capitalist model that that is the case. So how are we actually thinking about the real need to revitalize cities and economies using economic models that are for us and not against us? And can we really think about the role of just fundamentally not thinking that the quantitative is the only answer, that there is a place for rigorous qualitative methods to actually create some context around the change that we want to move to, some vision around the change that we want to move to, because it's that lack of vision, that kind of absence of vision that allows, you know, for there to be a certain amount of easy demagoguery that enters all parts of our reality. So I just want to say thanks, and I'm going to get off the PowerPoint, and then I can maybe talk a little bit more about my own creative practice and how I'm finding roots through this, or we can just immediately open it up to questions. But I'll just say thanks really quickly with that before I switch over.
Yay. Thank you, Cezanne. Thank you so much for that comprehensive presentation. We would like to wrap up at 1:30.
Sure.
Prepare for another session happening in the space. But I would like to quickly just open it up to questions for people in this space and joining us online. Feel free to ask us questions. Do we have any questions over there in the space?
We're good. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Yeah?
You have a comment.
He makes posters for the people. And I think qualitative approaches are critical to developing that kind of so-called creative, non-creative. All of them. That way.
Did you guys hear that question?
No.
Do you mind repeating that, Jess, into the mic?
Okay, let's try it again. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Let's try it again.
That was a one-time shot. It's not going to be very fluid now. But check out Paul Kennedy, printmaker, and based in Detroit. It's posters for the people at $25 a piece. He's a press printer. I think networking is crucial for connecting creative people. And I think qualitative methods and approaches are going to be much better than quantitative ones, as evidenced in your circle of so-called creative, non-creative, and people in between. They are all creative individuals working and need to be thought of and approached in that way.
I didn't hear that very well, but it sounded like there was a conversation around qualitative methods, in some cases being really more important than just a reliance on the quantitative. And I heard that there was an example based on a Detroit-based printmaker that does a number of works that are really for the people. Is that what I heard? That's the bits that I managed to hear.
Yep, you got the key points.
Okay, great.
Famous Paul Kennedy is his name. Check him out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Definitely. Saul Kennedy is what you just said. Okay.
Famous.
So yeah, I mean, yeah. So I don't disagree. I think it's a matter of knowing your audience, and so I liken it to finding yourself as a kind of diplomat. Maybe one day I fantasize too much about being a cultural attaché, but there's certainly this idea that if you are speaking to a native French speaker, you're going to try and do your best to try and converse in a language that makes them feel at ease and comfortable, but still with sticking to kind of your value propositions, your message, ultimately. And so for me, it's being able to have both and to be fluid enough to have both. But I do think that as an artist, there is a role to play with arming yourself with that second language. Because for me, it's so some of the things that we've created is we've created a Lawyers for the Creative Economy program. Now, most of us have volunteer lawyers for the arts programs, but even when you look at the way that they language around those programs, they're all languaged around how we help the artist out when they're in trouble. Right? It's an incredibly infantilizing idea of providing legal support to artists. If you think about the way that other people use legal services, they use legal services to get great, right? They use it to start up. And so for me, just even sort of as we were putting those programs together for artists that provide pro bono and low bono legal resources, we decided that we had to take a positional stance, which is that it's about helping the artist to succeed and not helping the artist to get out of trouble. And those things really matter. And so we spend a lot of time trying to help them feel advocated for and also help them advocate for themselves, whether they're speaking to other artists or other curators, which might be a language that they're super familiar with. Versus also needing to have that same power when they go to talk to their banker or go to talk to their lawyer or find themselves across the table negotiating for the intellectual property rights that will actually mean that they can actually secure a profit or earn a living off of their labor. And so for us, it is about choice. And choosing your battles and choosing your arguments, but also choosing your language. Depending on where you're at and who you're talking to.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cezanne. We have another question?
Hi. Hi, Taylor.
Can you hear me? Hello.
Good to see you.
No, same. Then you mentioned previously something about creative justice. Can you please elaborate on that within the scope of your work at Creative Many?
I think so. So can you repeat the question again? I could barely hear that. Something about my own work and then something about Creative Many?
You mentioned creative justice.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on what it looks like or means?
So for me, I sort of thought, because there's just so much that just makes my stomach turn about the way that we almost always hear the creative economy talked about, which is this idea that somehow, you know, we can just let the artists and creatives hang out in a neighborhood for a while as if nobody was already there. And then, like, hey, after a while, like, with a little bit of spray can and a little bit of magic, you get an economy out of it and vibrant places. And isn't that wonderful? And at the same time, all of the people that were there before, like, get moved out. And so for me, I was like, if I was going to actually be in this role as a creative industries person, as a creative economy person, like, what would my true north be? My true north was that it should be about a kind of economic justice for the people that have always been living in place, that have always been trying to figure out how to thrive in place. And then in what way is a creative person additive and not subtracted to that? Because, you know, for a variety of reasons, there is this idea that somehow the artist is both separate from society, but also a great commentator on it. And I sort of thought that we should unpick that a little bit more and really sort of think about the fact that there is both vernacular creativity. So, you know, what is our relationship to the amateur? What is our relationship to the traditional? What is our relationship to the culture bearers that have been making work without this idea of professionalization or remuneration? And then what is additive about the professional seeking to do that work, whether through culture bearing means or through sort of the way that we are educated in the arts? And then how do we actually think about compensation? Right, because we often think about working class, and we think about middle class, and we think about upper middle class, and middle class, and lower middle class, and then there's kind of this no space, right, where it's just generally wealthy. Sometimes we call them the 1%, but where in that is the artist? Where in that is the creative worker? I know museum director salaries that have a bigger wage gap than certain hospital administrators to their lowest paid staff. So we don't have a really good bounded idea in the arts or in the creative industries about like what wealth is. And a lot of it is because we just simply don't talk about it. We don't talk about money. We don't talk about labor. We create all of these kind of myths and memes around not selling out, which is just destructive psychologically, to be told that I just spent however long in a 4-year degree, let alone going to get a master's degree, and there are no more teaching jobs for me to do. And hey, isn't it just great? I can go be creative because that's what I love doing. Lots of people love doing their job, but they get paid for it. So for me, that was like the thing that I got angry about was that somehow my education, my work, my labor, my whatever was somehow valued less just because I loved it. So that's kind of how I sort of have really come to this, and really come to this from a learning place. Like, I have a lot of partners and peers at Allied Media Project that do a lot of work around restorative justice and work in other social justice communities. And I think for me, it was like, if I was going to have a creative economy that was situated in Michigan, that was situated in Detroit, it needed to be from that kernel of, if we're talking about the economy, it's got to be a vastly different economy than the one that we've inherited, which is this kind of trickle-down economic view. And so, you know, I needed to be able to talk to my peers and practitioners about why I did creative economy work, and that's where it came from.
Great. Are there any more questions there? I think we need to wrap up soon.
Thank you guys so much.
No, thank you so much. Thank you to the audience who came out. We appreciate you coming out to watch in the space. And thank you so much, Cezanne. This is really important.
Absolutely.
As always, took a lot of notes. Could you just leave maybe like your website or your Twitter handle in a way that people can follow up with you?
Yeah, so if you want to hear more ramblings on science, technology, and the creative economy, you really should follow me at CE_Wonk. But if you want to know a little bit more about my own creative practice and our work and our research, the best way you can find us is at rootoftwo. It's like the square root of 2. It's like what happens when arts and math people meet. So it's ROOTOFTWO. So it's just like the square root of 2. And you can find us at rootoftwo, rootoftwo.com, and also on Instagram at rootoftwo. And you can see our headless chicken projects and lots of other cool stuff. So,
Yes.
And before we go, I know you mentioned earlier that you don't mind sharing the PowerPoint just for everyone in the space, but for those who are also streaming, we do have a resource page that lives on
okay.
our website. So if
I'll email it over to you guys.
Thanks, that'd be great.
Great. All right. Thanks again. I wish I was in New York. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye.